welcome to this curtain raiser on the G20 summit. I'm Frank Pereira, and in this edition of the discourse, we will analyze the G20 summit and take a look back at India's presidency. Joining me on the program today are Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you to my guest. China can't be trusted. The reasons for President Putin's absence and Xi Jinping's absence are completely different, and this is something that we need to observe carefully. Russia is still a close friend, whereas China is up to mischief, and that's what we need to watch out for, is what the general is suggesting. All right, Professor, let me bring you in now. Let's talk about another aspect. Let's talk about India's role as a leader through all of this. Like the ambassador mentioned in his opening remarks as well, turbulent times when India took on the presidency, but has navigated through all of these ups and downs rather well and held everything together.
Let's first talk about India's qualifications to be the leader and hold the presidency of G20. Among the top economies of the world, it's a commonplace that India is the fastest growing economy now. 7.2%. Reserve Bank of India says we will hit 8.2 for the first quarter next year. Compared it with China, for example, 5.2% is what they claim. World believes about 4% growth rate in China. United States growing at 1.8%. So this both enormous drive that India's growth rate is providing to the global redemption post-pandemic and in middle of Ukraine crisis quite well qualifies India to be on the helm at a difficult time like this. And if you add the demographic dividend to it, of India's median age being almost 10 years less today than China's, 38 years versus 28 years and 8 months. Again, makes India a very attractive destination, and foreign direct investment has been rising, 75 billion from last year, for example. So in terms of being a driver of economic, trends, India is apparently fully qualified to be leading the G20 nations. Second point, how has India impacted upon in terms of showcasing that leadership? In the most simplistic terms, perhaps we are noticing today that world is witnessing an expanding polarization, which can be caricatured still as East and West, for which I think to some extent the coming closer of Russia and China can be held as accentuating that trend. On the other side, we are also noticing the reduction of the gap between North and South divide, which is another positive reality, which is where India has played a major game-changing role by bringing Global South to the center stage of all the proceedings of G20 summit meetings at various levels, through various meetings, through various officially engaged groups and their working groups, etc., etc. Look at the issues that India is today front-loading. Traditional medicine, debt crisis, climate finance, agricultural food security, digital public infrastructure, all kinds of issues that fundamentally reflect concerns of Global South. And that is a fundamentally game-changing for G7 that had over years had co-opted several other countries, and of course we now, for almost a decade, have had potent G20. But nevertheless, because as long as G20 was largely driven by G7, we were still looking at the same way of going forward in terms of urbanization, industrialization, growth rates being the focus, market-driven exercise. Largely becoming meetings between celebrated economists and policy wonks and some selected politicians in closed-door meetings. People who used to feel disconcerted, protest outside, are today sitting inside those meetings. That's a structural change that India has achieved over a period of time by expanding and opening doors and making Global South at the center stage, both in terms of its presence. And it's just also coincident that India is lucky and hopeful, because Continuously, it is the global South nations that are going to be sitting on the steering wheel now. Indonesia last year, India this year, Brazil next year, South Africa 2025. So global South is going to be on the leading position, holding presidencies one after another, is giving certain promise that the fundamental changes that India has tried to induce here or inject as a leader will be sustained and possibly flourish in coming time. So in that sense, there's a fundamental drift from material growth rate driven approach to overall socio-economic human face development, which is what is a enormous task. It's a reflection of the vision, reflection of the diversity that India has, reflection of the wisdom that India has. In that sense, I'm not saying all that India wanted will be fructifying in the summit meeting. We understand the challenges. There are even questions on whether final declaration will be there or not there. But in such situations, we understand that leaders are able to issue several other parallel statements, plans of action, and so on. So it's not that nothing is going to come out of summit meeting. And summit meeting, let me just underline the last point before I close my first comment. Summit meeting and joint declarations are nothing but only important part of the whole process that G20 is. So last 9 months, if you see, enormous amount of footwork that has happened. Over 100,000 formal delegates have visited India, and consensus was built on several issues at several levels. All those lower level consensus may not reach all the way to the national leaders, may not be acceptable there, but it has created a groundswell in that sense, where India's contribution as a leader and India's vision in that kind of how G20 now begins to think what are the issues important, what are the perspectives developing, is an indelible mark. Therefore, I think the unprecedented nature of G20 in 2023 is something that cannot be overlooked, cannot be ignored. Outcome of the summit meeting is one element of this entire process. India still has 81 days after the summit when presidency of India will continue. So it's not that the process is coming to an end. And of course, we know that Troika leadership will make sure India will be still sitting and contributing to what happens to G20 even next year. So I think India has used this opportunity very effectively, and advantages are going to accrue. Already the tourism is going up, investments are going up, partnerships with major countries in frontier technologies is moving up. Look at Chandrayaan and Aditya L1 happening on eve of G20 meeting, gives a very different image, and India becomes far more attractive. So in that sense, I think India has contributed to changing the fundamentals of G20 in last 9 months, but also has accrued several concrete advantages as a nation itself.
Absolutely, very right. Now, talking about challenges, talking about issues, what were some of the biggest issues over the last 9 or 10 months? Because new age 2023 brings with it a new set of problems, a new set of issues as well. How did we overcome them? And, how do we go forward as well?
I think, first of all, the biggest issue, even if this was not kind of advertised, was Ukraine crisis. This was always in the subconscious of all levels as to how will ultimately that issue will be tackled, and that issue remains still a major challenge. We saw that at foreign ministers meeting or at finance ministers meeting that created difficulty in creating a final statement. Other than that, there are issues where India has been able to, convince the world that India can contribute in providing that kind of access to technology. For example, India has been talking about, disaster resilient infrastructure. India has been talking about digital public infrastructure. India has been talking about healthcare, traditional medicine. Climate finance has been another major issue. And in that sense, India has been raising issues where it wants to showcase a new model where the sharing of knowledge or sharing of platforms or sharing of technology is not held hostage to whims and fancies, but it's easily made available to those who wish to take that. So I think these are new issues that India fundamentally wants to showcase how there could be different ways of doing business. For example, like China had also started showcasing a new way of doing business where it would not ask questions of human rights, questions of whether a country has a democracy, transparency. So that was another way of saying we have a different way of building partnerships, investments, technology transfers. India is doing also in another way, emphasizing standardization, regulation, transparency, and so on, and offering to share digital platforms. I understand that the delegates to the summit meeting are being familiarized and given a UPI platform to do transactions online when they are here. So it's hands-on sort of exposure to people who are visiting India as to how online payments have become a norm in India now. It's like at some stage, let's say credit cards had become a sudden change in Western countries, and everybody was no longer carrying cash. Now in India, we are not even carrying the credit card. We are carrying UPI application on your mobile phone. Or COVID, is another great example where all your certification, all your dates of vaccination, all your records were coming online on your phone screen. So there are things that India has showcased as India's strengths, and how India is willing to share that with others without really, acting as if it's some great achievement of India which has a cost if anybody else wants to take that from India. So that I think is something that India has really positively brought about in terms of how India can contribute to how partnerships will be built over a period of time. Another major issue I think that also is at subconscious level is raising certain irritations now is the fact that the President Putin or President Xi Jinping would have been able to join the summit meeting. It would have resulted in a lot of other areas where India could have showcased its diplomatic finesse and resulted in very, very groundbreaking sort of outcomes in terms of bilaterals we could have achieved. So, G20 is a multilateral meeting, but as Ambassador knows, in all multilateral meetings, a lot more happens on the sidelines. And President Joe Biden himself, 2 days back, put it on record that he was looking forward to meeting President Xi Jinping in New Delhi and will miss that opportunity. So, in that sense, the possibility of India contributing to the breakthrough on Ukraine by making some of these people sit face to face and ideally maybe organize a bilateral between them. That would be again something will be amiss, has been on subconscious of India, where not only building consensus on issues of G20, but things that India could have done on the sidelines. Also, for example, for India-China relations, there could have been some way forward in case President Xi was to be in India. You would remember that Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping had started this whole informal summits, which was a very innovative way of organizing a very, off the record, without agenda, informal conversation between two leaders, and they were able to showcase, not just build that kind of bonhomie, but you would remember that they would be seen on the board, walking in the woods, or walking around the monuments. That was a way of showcasing the world, a new way of, shall we say, great power relations or emerging powers relations. And in that sense, that kind of innovative component of G20 summit again is something that India could have done it, but may not happen now. And even for China, this would have given China opportunities because increasingly, the world is getting a little more anxious about you know concerns about China. The pandemic showed us that 30% of global manufacturing happening in one country is not something that world can live with. So we are today talking of redesigning supply chains, friend-shoring, onshoring, and so on. It is understandable that decoupling is not possible. The world is so deeply intertwined today that complete decoupling is not going to happen. But can transitions happen, piecemeal and peaceful? That is what Xi Jinping's presence in G20 perhaps again could have contributed to making sure that transition takes place, but transitions happen which are of mutual benefit rather than attempt to really ignore other or hurt other if possible. Some of these manufacturing will move to other countries. Some of them will move to India. So that is bound to happen. But things that could have been related to G20 summit meeting, as that is the space or place where some of these breakthroughs happened, understandings were developed. Now, those issues, I think, would be again amiss were important issues in the backdrop, in the subconsciousness of India's mind. And finally, I think again, another jump for India's visibility around the world, G20 is a great opportunity for India to
Absolutely,
showcase to
absolutely.
the world. And that kind of showcasing of new India, changed India, confident India is something which again was on our mind, and we have worked on that direction. And I think to a great extent we have seen that we have been able to achieve a great deal in that direction of showcasing different India, new India, and the leadership of India in that sense. So I think there are multiple issues that dominated India's psyche when it took the leadership, not just putting forward the global south, which was the most important agenda. Therefore, within 4 weeks of taking off the presidency, India had already hosted the voice of the global south. So that was a plan, already there as to what India wants to do with that presidency. But there were a lot of lingering other issues. Some of them have been successful. Some of them we have moved forward with. Some of them are going to be seen as missed opportunities now. But that's the part of life. That is reality. That is how it happens all the time. I think the package deal looks like attractive, even if there are some areas where we can think that we could have made things better.
Absolutely. So that's the nature of the game, and that's and Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Thank you. I think we have spent 45 minutes or plus discussing the foreign policy angle of G20. There is also an important domestic politics angle to the G20. For any rising power, it is very significant to train your citizens, train your common people on the street to be able to understand why is this country as it rises is going to invest much more attention, resources in international responsibilities or challenges that it wishes to address at international level. And G20 has perhaps also been an opportunity for India to train and make our own population aware of what is India trying to do, which is beyond immediate direct, you know, help for our own citizens. But indirectly, by helping the world, it will also help Indian citizens. So as India grows and begins to take greater responsibilities in global governance issues, as it begins to face more challenges of building consensus in different forums, and that attention of Indian leadership comes at enormous cost. Every hour of your leader is very significant as to where he or she is spending it. And to train your domestic population to fully understand the gravitas of that exercise is something that G20 has become a kind of an opportunity for India. And that is where, it has, as I said, moved in terms of its way of functioning from ivory tower kind of, intellectual exercise
Mm.
to what Prime Minister calls it now as People's Festival. And in that sense, I think that transformation will have impact on G20, but also has enormous impact on our own domestic politics, which, we say foreign policy is always nothing but an extension of domestic politics. And training your own people to allow your leadership to be more engaged with global affairs is something that is important. And I think G20 in that sense helped us in the last 9 months to sort of accelerate that process of training our own people, making them more aware of why foreign policy is increasingly significant for our own welfare, for our own prosperity, for our own peace. Thank you.
Absolutely. Very well said. All right.